Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. An original adaptation written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Part 3. The Green Knight. Silence reigned in the great hall at Camelot. But this was not the silence that had accompanied the good-natured story told by Bishop Baudouin. That silence had been born of a shared story, a group decision to sit and listen with respect as a master craftsman told a tale. It was uplifting, positive, a shared gift. This silence was different. This silence was born of alarm and anticipation. "Shall there be no apparitions from mystical forces, O King?" The booming voice echoed out across the hall, shattering the merriment of a moment before. The source of the voice was not yet clear, but all around the table hands were reaching for weapons, and eyes were straining to search the shadows. Gawain's head craned round, searching for the source of the sound. Lancelot had stood guarding the king and queen, flanked by Bors and Bedivere. A small voice in the back of Gawain's head nagged at him. "Why didn't you think to do that?" "Oh," came the unseen voice again, "I think there shall be apparitions." Instantly, the room was filled with hissing, as all the torches and candles in the hall went dark. They were plunged into gloom, and Gawain heard gasps from those around him. He remembered the story the bishop had just told about the black eyes of Glamour the Draugr, and he shuddered. He wished his sword was at his waist, but no swords were allowed in the king's presence in times of peace. The only source of light in the room was the great hearth fire on the western wall, and its rippling light seemed somehow small and shallow as shadows stretched around them. Gawain picked up a meat knife in one hand and was just searching for some kind of implement he could use as a shield when a woman's voice called out. "The fire!" she gasped, and Gawain saw it was the pretty maid he'd been smiling at before. She wasn't smiling now, though. Her face was drawn in a terrified mask as her hand pointed towards the fireplace. Gawain's head span as he followed the direction of her finger, and he saw what had shocked her so. In the great hearth, a shape was writhing in the flames. At first, Gawain thought someone had fallen into the fire in the confusion, but before he could think to move, the shape grew and changed. It lunged out of the flames towards the centre of the hall, and with a start, Gawain realized it was a horse's head. A huge warhorse was striding out of the flickering flames towards them. Another gasp rang out, and Gawain realized it had come from him. But he was far from alone. All around the hall, gasps and cries were ringing out as the huge horse stepped slowly forward. The men and women of Camelot drew back, trying to make some distance from the eerie creature, and as its shoulders breached the flames, Gawain saw the rider upon its back. With the fire behind him, the figure was silhouetted in shadow, but the sheer size of him was shocking. Gawain was not short, but this figure must have been his own height and half again, and it was broad and powerfully made. Gawain took another step back as the horse and rider completed their journey through the flames and stood motionless in front of the fire. Still atop the horse, the figure raised a huge hand, and with a soft fluttering, the torches in the candles in the room flickered back into life. Gawain found himself blinking back the brightness as he strained to get a better view of the mysterious figure, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The figure was indeed huge, as Gawain had suspected, but that wasn't the most striking thing about him. In the newly restored light of the torches, Gawain saw that this man, every inch of him, was green. His powerful arms were a shimmering shade of emerald, and his face shone with the same verdant hue. His hair, while darker, was also green, and his plaited beard was a waterfall of green grass tresses across his broad chest, like ivy clinging to a tree. His boots were a deep piney green, and the belt and braces he wore were the same. As Gawain looked closer, he saw that the belt, boots, and braces were all worked with intricate designs of holly and oak leaves chasing each other round the figure's waist, legs, and arms. In one hand he held a holly branch, all covered in leaves and berries. In the midst of all that green, the berries seemed to glow a rich ruby red. In his other hand, he held a vast axe, its head resting casually upon his shoulder. Its shaft was a deep black and at least 4 feet long. The head was easily as long as Gawain's forearm. It too was green, but the blade edge shone with a glittering gleam where it had been honed and polished to a perfect edge. It must have weighed half as much as a full suit of armour, but the massive man held it as lightly as if it were a willow stick. Gawain's legs seemed to be stuck, unable to move. He kept telling them it was time to step backwards, but somehow they weren't getting the message, and he stood stock still. "At least they've not collapsed beneath you," came the voice in his head, though he suspected the reason his body refused to move is because his legs folding up beneath him was an all-too-real possibility. Everyone in the great hall was staring at the huge figure on horseback, and Gawain could tell they were all having a similar reaction to his own. Jaws were wide open, but no one made a sound as they gaped at the giant. For his part, the huge man stared back at him. There was no shock on his face, though. He simply swept his eyes around the room, took in all the faces, and dismissed them. Opening his mouth, that booming baritone rang out to them all again, and the rich sound seemed to resonate in the air. "And who is the lord of this great hall?" There was a moment of uncomfortable shifting. Lancelot, Bors, and Bedivere tightened their formation in front of the king, all clutching improvised weapons, but Arthur placed a hand on Lancelot's shoulder and the knight moved aside. "I am Arthur, ap Uther, Penthraig and High King of all Britain." He strode forward, addressing the looming figure, and Gawain was amazed at how steady the king's voice was as he spoke. He didn't think he would have trusted his voice to whisper at that moment, never mind speak. Arthur stepped closer, looking up at the mounted man, and Gawain saw he was barely able to meet the horse's eyes, let alone the man on top of it. "And who might you be, sir?" the king continued. "You are welcome in our halls and at our table, but guests give their names in the court of Camelot." The green man let out a rumbling chuckle. "High King of Britain, is it? Well, I have dwelt in this land since before it had names, and you are no king of mine." There was no menace in the voice. He simply said it as a statement of fact. "Well, what is your business here, then, sir?" Arthur asked, and again Gawain was stunned by how straight and steady the king looked in the face of something so otherworldly. "But then," said the voice in his mind, "that's why he's the king." "You have disturbed our peace," Arthur went on, "and if you mean us violence, then I can tell you, you shall not find us easy opponents to overcome." The green man's head rocked back, and his rich voice rang out in a rolling laugh. In some part of his mind, Gawain thought it might actually be a rather pleasant laugh in different circumstances. Here, though, he felt only fear. "Violence," chuckled the figure. "Do you see me garbed for war? Am I decked out in shining armour? If I were here for violence, I would not be bearing this, would I?" He held up the holly bough clutched in his hand, and throughout the nights there was an exchange of blank faces. Eventually, Bishop Badawin's voice spoke out. "A green branch is an ancient symbol of peace, my lords," the bishop intoned. "Its use goes back centuries." "I am glad to see at least one of you still knows the old ways," said the green figure, "though I would not have imagined it would come from one of your churchmen. No matter. It is enough to say, I come in peace." "And yet you are armed for war," replied Arthur, gesturing to the huge axe on the man's shoulder. The giant looked at the axe as if he'd almost forgotten it was there. "This?" asked the verdant visitor. "This is no item for war. And besides, I would not make war against a bunch of beardless boys such as these." He looked at the Knights of the Round Table, the finest warriors in all of Britain, and, once again, he dismissed them all. "This," he said, holding out the axe as if it weighed next to nothing, "is for a game." There was a deeply uncomfortable silence. All the knights enjoyed playing games and contests involving danger and violence. It went hand in hand with knighthood, but none of them knew any games which involved enormous axes with razor-sharp edges. "A game?" asked the king. "A game," confirmed the man. "Is it not traditional to play games at this time of year you call the Christ's Mass? Well, I have a game for you." Whosoever in this hall can strike a blow upon me and have one delivered back to him in return shall win this axe as a prize." There was more silence, so the Green Man went on. "I shall stand here in this hall and take the first blow without flinching, and whatsoever be delivered to me I shall return in kind within 1 year and a day." There was still more silence. "Come now, is this the famous court of Camelot? Are these the mighty knights of the table?" He stared around the hall. "Stories are told of your bravery. Songs are sung of your heroism. Was that all blowhard bluster?" Still no knight would meet his eye. He held out the handle of the axe as if daring someone to take it. "Oh, I see that it was all lies. There are no great warriors, just boys in metal suits and a king in a paper crown." He sneered down at Arthur, and a muscle twitched on the king's cheek, and Gawain was shocked to see that his fists were clenched. He'd always seen Arthur so calm, measured, and in control. It was a shock to realize he had a temper to lose. "My lady," said the Green Man, addressing Guinevere, "I am sorry to see that you are so ill-matched with a coward for a king—" "Enough!" Arthur's voice rang out, and the Green Man stopped short, a smile playing at his lips. Arthur reached up and took hold of the handle of the axe, pulling it towards him and grasping the weapon in both hands. Now it was in the hands of a normal man. Gawain could see it was even bigger than he had thought. Everyone in the room looked too shocked to move. The king weighed the axe carefully and drew it up to his shoulder as if preparing to strike. He took a single step forwards. "No, my king!" a voice called out. And Gawain was shocked to find it was his own. Thank you for listening. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a Settle Stories commission. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Story consultant was Miriam Sarin. Music was Tectonic by Saedra, downloaded via Uppbeat. It was a Parable Arts production.